Hello and welcome back to the Western Theater and the Civil Wars Department Number 2 podcast. My name is Derek Lindo, and we are about to get back into our discussion with Joseph Ricci on General George D. Wagner, part 2 of that discussion. So if you've missed part 1, you definitely need to go back and listen to that before jumping into this one here. That way it just makes a little more sense for you. Before we do jump into this, I do want to remind you to sign up for the, if you're in the area, the Fort Donelson Symposium next month. Daryl's going to be leading a tour on McClernand's attack that took place on February 13th, 1862. So it's one of those actions that took place before the major fighting that during the breakout and the bombardment and things like that. So go to westerntheatercivilwar.com. You can RSVP there just so that we have a good idea of how many people to expect, especially for parking, and make sure we don't need to change any of the logistics for the tour. So it is free. There's nothing you need to pay for. You just show up and listen to Daryl talk about this particular attack. So go to westerntheatercivilwar.com, scroll on down until you see McClernand's attack there, and just RSVP. And with that, we're going to get back to our discussion on George D. Wagner. Hello, everybody. So we are back again with Joseph Ricci, me and Daryl, talking about General George D. Wagner at Franklin, and that is the part we're actually getting up to right now. So last time we ended right before the fight starts, and we're going to pick right up at that spot today. So, Joseph, they're in the advanced works. Does Union High Command even think anything is going to happen that afternoon or that night?
No. Why would they? I mean, when the Federal Army arrives in Franklin around 4 a.m, the expectation is that they're going to just go across the Harpeth River. But then the river is impassable. The bridges are out. Water levels have dropped. The bridges are still damaged. So the expectation for the Army is that they'll simply build the bridges and then they'll march across and they'll be in Nashville by nightfall or by at least nighttime. And there wouldn't be any fighting because how could Hood's army possibly catch them? It's a 14-mile march, and by the time they get there, it'd be getting dark. There's just no way. So that kind of concentrates at the high command, and then you can see it as it drops through all the ranks, right down to privates on the line. The only people who might expect that there is going to be a fight are the men on the advance line. The men of Lane and Conrad's brigades, because they've been in the fight much of the afternoon with skirmishers and kind of the advanced sort of elements of the Confederate Army. So if no one else expects there's going to be a fight, at least there's a few, 3,500 or so men that have some sneaking suspicion. But by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's pretty hard to deny that the entire Confederate Army is advancing towards you. And that's really where things start to come off the tracks. But if you kind of go back to around 2, 3 o'clock, that hour is really, really critical for the Federal Army. And there's almost a command paralysis on almost, I would argue, on the same level as what the Confederates experienced 24 hours earlier in Spring Hill. It's just left hand stops talking to right hand has no idea what left hand is doing. And there seems to be this kind of malaise that comes over the entire army. And then by around 3:30, pickets start moving forward, skirmishers start moving forward, I should say. And there's a little bit of a firefight between Wagner's men and some of the advanced elements of the army, some of the sharpshooters maybe, Cleburne's division, some of the kind of advanced sort of thrown out skirmishers ahead of the entire rest of the army make their way out. And by 3:30, Wagner actually makes a run from the Carter House or near his headquarters out to the advance line. And he meets with Colonel John Lane, and Lane asks him, what should we do? And going back to what we talked about in the last kind of portion of this, Wagner starts to make mistakes, simple little things. I don't know if this is really one of them. Because again, he's trying to follow the spirit of three different interpretations of his role. He's trying to be the advance guard, he's trying to be the rear guard, and he's trying to follow the spirit of the orders from General David Stanley earlier that morning. So at 3:30, when John Lane asks, what do we do? Wagner responds, tell your sergeants to fix bayonets and hold the men in position. Kind of seems a little strange, right? There's some people that would say that it was an irrational order, that he was being brash and he was being aggressive. Honest to goodness, I go back to what I said earlier. They're the only guys on the field that can see further south. So why not stay out there and monitor the situation for, even if it's just another couple minutes, try and see if you can feel where the attack is coming from. Because the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that for us in 2025, it's really easy to say, oh yeah, well, the Confederate Army was going to attack. We all know that they were going to do that. They were going to charge. But the Army throughout the day didn't expect that. And using just a couple days earlier as an example, when the Federal Army gets to Columbia, the Confederate Army gets there too, and they form up into a big giant line of battle, and then they dig in. What's to say they don't do that at Franklin? So it's actually worthwhile for Wagner to sit out there for just a little bit longer. Now, you can criticize him and say he should have been out there with his division, all those things. All of those criticisms I think are valid. And my mission at one point in time was to completely vindicate him of all wrongs. I don't think that's ever going to happen. But I can at least try and add a little bit of nuance and maybe some of the context here that helps. Maybe he should have been out front. I don't know. I can't tell you what he should have, would have, or could have done. I can tell you what he did, which is that he rode out to the front. He instructed Lane to have the sergeants fix bayonets, and he rode back to the main line. And around 4 o'clock, the Confederate Army starts moving forward. And now Joseph Conrad sends him a message. And Conrad reports back and says, we're under attack. What should we do? This is where I go back to visibility, right? The elevations, the undulations in the ground south of the Federal line. Wagner looks south and either doesn't see it or can't see it. There's pretty good reason to believe that he couldn't have seen Loring on Walthal's division just because they're still behind McGavock's Grove. So it's hard to make them out. Bates' division hasn't come out from behind Brown's division yet, because remember, as they come off the pike, Bates still actually deploying. So he has to kind of wheel out of line, go behind sort of the left flank of Claiborne, all of Brown's division, before he can wheel into position to assault the works himself. So he's kind of screened by what's in front of him, and Claiborne and Brown's divisions are pretty much concealed by the ground south of town. You can't see them until they cross Privet Knob. So Wagner responds, never mind. Stand there and fight them. The 2nd Division will whip all hell. I still think that's a great title for a book, and I'm still working on it.
I agree.
It's a great title. Stand there and fight them, right? Or my personal part of it is I like Fight Like Hell. That's that's very much the kind of demeanor that he has had throughout his entire career, is Fight Like Hell.
I like that title.
I think so. I might be a little biased, but I think it's a pretty good title. Although I will tell you, the working title right now is actually called To Save the Union. So it comes from a speech that he gave in 1861, just before he went off to raise the 15th Indiana. I kind of took pieces and parts of it and bound it all together. Anyhow, that's aside from the point. He sends back to Conrad to stand there and fight. So Conrad and Lane's brigades stand and fight. And for a moment or two, actually throw back. It's probably the Texans from Granbury's brigade. Maurice Marcoute of the 15th Missouri said that our fire checked them for a moment, and they kind of pull back down the hill in front of the works, and then they hit them again. And of course, it's when they hit them again that the line breaks. But in the meantime, Wagner has rebounded, right? So he says, never mind that, stand there and fight. And then maybe 4-5 minutes goes by, and now he can see it, right? Loring and Walthall have cleared through McGavock's Grove. Bates probably would come out from behind Brown's division now, and he can hear the general kind of fight along the advanced line. And he sends back an aide. It's not exactly clear who of his staff goes back out. If I had to wager a guess, it's probably E.G. Whitesides, his chief of staff. Has a long history within the Army of the Cumberland. He had been on Opdyke's staff when he was a regimental officer, so all of the kind of connections that you might expect. But it's a verbal order, so it's never submitted in the official record. It's never put in any reports, nothing. Wagner simply says, fall back. That's it. Jacob Cox in 1897 said that we must remember that Wagner regained his focus, or regained his footing, regained his bearing. That was it. Let's remember even now that he regained his bearing. So clearly he makes a mistake, and now he's trying to correct it. But the problem is it's just a moment too late.
Yeah.
And Conrad and Lane's men are overwhelmed, and you have to imagine what maybe the tension on that advanced line might have been like, because you've got these 3-year veterans whose enlistments are about to expire next to men who've just been sort of mustered in as volunteers, some of them, but then a lot of draftees and a lot of substitutes. And make it worse, both of the brigade commanders out front are, they share a combined experience of about 36 hours. So there's, tensions are high, right? And all of a sudden it's one guy breaks, and then 5, then 10, and then a whole company's gone, and then a whole regiment's gone, and then everybody starts to run. And one of the problems with how this happens in a narrative, popular kind of narrative, is it's easy to explain it as Wagner breaks and the Confederates follow. It's probably more accurate to say that everybody is running as this kind of gaggle of humanity, gray and blue, Federal and Confederate, everybody's arm in arm running towards the earthworks. Guys are being shot in the back, trampled over the top of. There are men who are hit so many times and stepped on so much that they're just completely unrecognizable. But Wagner's troops fall over the top of the earthworks. The problem is that all of the men on the main line, particularly those in the center, are forced to hold their fire. Mm-hmm. While they may have been able to tear away at Francis Cockrell and the Missouri Brigade, wouldn't be a discussion about Franklin if I didn't somehow work in talking about Francis Cockrell and the Missouri Brigade. And if you ever want to do a podcast on how cool they are.
Oh, for sure. I really like that brigade. Yeah.
Okay.
I really like them.
It's hard not to like Cockrell and the Missouri Brigade.
Mm-hmm.
Can I say badasses? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. They're the most badass guys on the field that day. Easy, hands down. But they're getting mauled, and then all of a sudden, all the fire stops. The only guns that are still firing are artillery pieces. 1st Kentucky Battery, 6th Ohio Battery. Theo Thomason wrote in his report that he was putting shells out at 1,750 yards, kind of putting them right over the top of Wagner's head, and then actually walking it in towards the line. So they're hitting right behind the retreat all the way in.
That's amazing to be able to do that. I mean,
it's just good artillery, right?
Yeah,
it's good, skillful artillerymen and good crews.
Mm-hmm.
But Wagner's men come across the top of the works, and another misconception, right, is that as they come in, everybody breaks and runs, right? So 104th Ohio or 100th Ohio breaks, and the 104th Ohio kind of falls in on itself and sort of screens Baldwin, 6th Ohio, and everybody starts to rush back towards James Riley's brigade. One of the things that's almost completely forgotten is that when they talk about the rout of Wagner's division, is that there are regiments, portions of regiments from the advance line, that when they get to the earthworks, they stop and they turn around and they fight. 97th Ohio, Lieutenant Colonel Milton Barnes wrote a letter to his wife, Rhoda. He wrote one on the 3rd one on the 1st and another one on the 3rd of December. And in those letters, he says, I got to the works and I told the men, you've done enough running. It's time to stand here and do some fighting.
Yeah.
And they do. And it's not a lot. We're talking penny packets of maybe 100 guys, 200 guys along that section of the line, a 200-yard hole in the center of the Federal line. But it is enough that if you are a Confederate soldier stampeding across the earthworks, full bore, now you've got to fight, these 200 guys kind of just standing there, breathless, but ready to go. And that's a piece I think has always kind of fascinated me, is that it's easy to say, oh, there's a giant hole, Hood was about to win, and then all of a sudden, the great hero of the Battle of Franklin, heavy quotes and a lot of emphasis on that.
Riley.
What?
James Riley.
Oh, yes, James Riley.
Yes.
Exactly.
Make sure you get the name in there.
Thank God you said it. Because when they show up with pitchforks, it won't be at my house, it'll be at yours. That's okay. They've come to my house enough. Oh, imagine that time I said that. George Thomas, well, he was good, but that was it. That's all I had to say was, but.
Yeah.
And it showed up. But Riley, almost without kind of thinking, he's just a good enough soldier at this phase of the war where it's just instinctual. Riley just shouts charge, and his brigade, or reserve brigade in its own right, because he's only got the 100 and 104th Ohio on the main line, the 12th and 16th Kentucky, 8th Tennessee U.S., and sort of kind of attached to him, 175th Ohio. All of those guys just rush towards the works, and they start to kind of fill the hole. Now, granted, this is hand-to-hand fighting. It's up close. It's personal. It's brutal. Across the road, 50th Ohio, 72nd Illinois, all those regiments, they've broken. So you have this big hole, and you could largely blame that on Wagner's division. Because you could say, oh, well, they got inside the works, and they'd have turned around and fought, and it'd have been fine. Confederates never would have broken through the works had they been there. Or you could say that they should have stayed out there and just been annihilated, whatever. Because they make the retreat, the Confederates come in with them, and there's hell to pay now. I guess we have to go back and talk about the elephant in the room, which is the other hero of the battle. So the 6th Ohio Battery? No. I guess we have to talk about him, right? Do we have to talk about Emerson Updike?
Maybe just a little bit. Yeah.
It's time.
Well, if you don't, he will. So
right. In 100 years, 20 years after I'm dead, he'll start writing about it. I'm convinced he's what caused all of our technical problems.
He was. He does not want this getting out, and I would not be surprised if something just got zapped here in the next few minutes.
The ghost of Emerson Updike strikes again. Now, can I share a fun story? I know we've done a lot of sides. I was doing a battlefield tour, and I was actually getting to this point in the tour. I'm talking about Opdyke's brigade coming forward. And I said, the weather had been kind of brutal that day. It had been kind of on and off thunderstorms, but we got lucky, and we're plowing through it. And the wind starts to pick up right as we get to Carter Hill. And I'm getting ready to bring Opdyke's brigade forward. And all of a sudden, I hear this crash. And as a bolt of lightning strikes a tree and knocks some branches down, it's like, all right, anyhow, so he saves the day, and all glory to his name. Crown him with eternal fame. He is so wonderful. But I have to kind of go back. All right, so Emerson Updike's brigade gets to Franklin morning of November 30th, exhausted after the night march, exhausted after all of the kind of work that they had done in the rear guard, and they are posted in reserve in the support positions when Wagner's men are still out front. By the time they get to the advanced line area, though, Wagner has already deployed Lane's brigade and Conrad's brigade. Now, Lane is on the west side of the pike, Conrad's on the east side of the pike. And the intention is to have Opdyke extend the flank with his brigade. And this is, you kind of have to take all of this with a grain of salt, because so much of this is kind of post-war conjecture. But a discussion is apparently had between Opdyke and Wagner. We can never really get to what they said to one another, because there is a soldier who says that he heard the entire argument, and that's Captain John Schellenberger of Company B, 64th Ohio. The problem is that Captain John Schellenberger and Company B of the 64th Ohio are anywhere from 200 to 300 yards away from the Columbia Turnpike where this alleged conversation took place. So if he heard it, he's got great hearing. If it's what I think, it's a good soldier story.
Mm-hmm.
Opdyke and Wagner were talking, then becomes Opdyke and Wagner disagreed with one another, then becomes Opdyke and Wagner got into an argument, then becomes Opdyke and Wagner got into a shouting match. And then in 1991 or 2, when Wiley Sword sits down, he calls it an explosive war of wills.
Man, it sounds like a middle school story. Like there was several, early in my teaching career, there was a fight in the cafeteria, and all I did was put my lunchbox down. I ran over there and stopped. By the time lunch was over and I had my kids back in my room, the story had been that not only did I just put my lunchbox down, I threw it to the side, jumped over tables, and picked both kids up by the back of their shirts. And I was like some kind of hero. I was like, wow, that changed really fast.
If you just wait another 10 years,
yeah,
you too can write this in a New York newspaper and become the hero.
Yeah.
Middle school fight. You got it. The Battle of Middle School. Yep. Work for that brevet. I promise it's coming. But so who knows what they said to one another, and who knows the nature of this discussion. If they got into an argument, it shouldn't surprise us, right? We talked about this a little bit, but think about the personalities at play here. You've got a kind of younger upstart, really kind of haughty, I won't say egotistical, because I think that is a little too harsh. Look at that, me pulling punches here. But I think Opdyke can be somewhat self-absorbed. He can also be very kind of self-righteous in a way that comes across as condescending to pretty much anybody who's in the room. And then you've got George Wagner, this kind of rough and tumble, sort of prickly, rough around the edges, generally kind of a disagreeable person anyways. So if they don't necessarily mesh well, now we add in the fact that they're exhausted, they've been fighting all day, and there's just this big disagreement between them and employing Opdyke's brigade again. And that's really what this comes down to. Later, the discussion is about the position. The position was folly, that the position was folly. Problem is, nobody's saying the position was folly in November of 1864 or even December of 1864.
Yeah, Cox didn't seem to disagree with the position.
No, the position is the problem. Staying there for just a minute too long might be the problem.
Uh-huh.
Not coming back to the work fast enough, that's the problem. But the position itself, there's nothing wrong with the position. It's just that they're exhausted. And who could blame them? And who could blame Opdyke for sticking up for his men? If you're a soldier in Opdyke's brigade, you're saying, yeah, get him, boss. I'm sick and tired of this. They have a discussion. Clearly, Opdyke does not agree with the posting in that position. But however this goes, the column keeps moving. And they move north, right into the works. And if you listen to Opdyke's position on this, and I'll give you, this is just good knowledge to have. Generally speaking, spouses are most honest with their spouse, and nobody is, right? I can lie to your face right now and then go home and tell my wife everything I thought.
Yeah.
Right. You do the same thing, right? If you get into a discussion and you go, oh man, I really don't like that. You go home, but you tell your wife honestly about what happens.
Oh, yeah.
Emerson Opdyke, if he ever embellishes in his reports, if he embellishes in his memoirs, if he embellishes in newspapers, there's one person that he's incredibly honest with all the time. Lucy, his wife. Without fail.
Mm-hmm.
So he writes her a letter in the days following Franklin. It doesn't mention anything about an argument. It doesn't say they got into a fight. There was no explosive war of wills. Instead, all he says is that brigade was posted in reserve. Wagner told me, fight wherever you please. We all know you'll fight. He trembled with fear, and he said, "I may not see you again." And that's it. George Wagner in his report mentions nothing about an argument. And we've seen how he can be with insubordinate and kind of dysfunctional subordinate officers. He writes them up in his reports. Doesn't mention anything about Opdyke. Opdyke's men move into position. They go into reserve, and they do the thing that they've wanted to do for basically 36 hours, which is get some shut-eye, get some food in them, get some coffee. Charles Clark in the 125th Ohio said that the air was full of the smell of boiling coffee and bacon fat. It just ruminates through the area. Soldiers taking off their equipment, they're dropping their packs, they're taking off their ammunition belts, rifles are stacked. And Opdyke even says he went into town, said, I went into town to visit some friends and say howdy. You got to think, 125th Ohio had been in Franklin earlier in the war and had spent time in garrison there, so that he knows people is not unsurprising. Goes into town, comes back, and by 4 o'clock, Confederate armies are moving forward, and let's say it's within about 15 or 20 minutes, Wagner's 2 forward brigades have broken, and what Opdyke's men can see from the shadow of Carter Hill, because they're down what is today this kind of torn up strip mall parking lot. They're close to the Franklin Police Department headquarters. What they can see coming down the pike are the brigade pennants of Conrad's brigade and Lane's brigade, and then they can see soldiers kind of stampeding past. And without really any orders, they just simply take up their rifles and they rush forward to the position. Veteran soldiers doing what veteran soldiers do. They react. And Opdyke's men fall into that position. Now, it depends who you read as to where Emerson Opdyke was during this. Where should a brigade commander be when his brigade goes forward like this?
Well, if he's using Casey's taxi, shouldn't be pretty much in the center of the brigade.
Center front or center rear?
Center. You didn't like that answer. 2 up, 2 back, right? So The whole point of that is brigade commander can, if it's a 4 regiment brigade.
It's 6, this one.
Yeah, it's 6 here because everything's consolidated. Center is, Casey's, right?
So he should maybe be not in the front. Well, Opdyke says he was in the front, leading his men forward with a pistol, clubbing Confederates over the head. There's another account that says that he was in the rear with a rifle, ushering his men forward, threatening to shoot anyone who ran away or club them. Take whatever you want, right? This is the piece about Opdyke that is important. Riley's brigade has gone forward. The green troops of the 183rd Ohio and the 44th Missouri are holding on for dear life. The guns of the 20th Ohio Battery have run out of canister, so they're now firing explosive shell at point-blank range. The rallied mainline regiments are hanging on near the Carter farm, and there's weak spots. There's little pockets where Confederates could break through. Opdyke's men seal off the weak spots along the secondary line. That's what it comes down to. And at some point, having returned from his ride on the western portion of the line towards the center, Jacob Cox sees Emerson Opdyke and says a phrase that Emerson Opdyke will never forget for the rest of his life. "My dear Emerson, you've just saved the day." He goes to the grave arguing that he is the hero. No one else could have done what he did. No one else was going to do what he did. No one else really mattered. Fighting wears on. And where's George Wagner in all of this? He's down by the river trying to piece together his shattered brigade. They suffer some almost 1,260 casualties.
Yeah.
Of the 3,500 men that are out front, now that 1,200 also counts in Opdyke's brigade too, but they suffer immense casualties on the advance line and the counterattack. But Wagner's down by the river, and he shouts out to his men, "Stand by me, boys, and I'll stand by you." Trying to invoke some loyalty, trying to piece together his old command, because his 2nd Brigade was his for the better part of 2 years. He knows those men. He knows the officers. He knows those soldiers. And that night, they finally get across the Harpeth. And by the next day, they're in Nashville. And then this is where things really start to fall apart. Typically, when battle reports are sent in, right, you've got your company commander who reports to your regimental officer, and your regimental officer then invites a report, and he submits it to the brigade commander, and then the brigade commander writes a report on behalf of his entire brigade and submits it to the division commander, and the division commander writes a report based off all the brigade commander reports, and he submits that to the corps commander. Then the corps commander writes one for the army commander, and then the army commander writes his. Joseph Conrad skips a step. When everybody else starts filing reports, he just takes his and goes straight to the corps level, and it goes right to the army level. Conrad's report effectively doesn't seem all that serious. He says, basically we're left out front and we're there too long. And, the general commanding, he kind of lays a lot of the blame at Wagner's feet. And Lane then writes his report, and Opdyke writes his report, and Wagner, meanwhile, is putting his together, but he's also visiting with other officers. And this is kind of fishy looking, because he's talking to Jacob Cox, and he's saying, well, I really, I tried to do the best I could out there. And he's getting Cox to vouch for him so that when he writes his report, it looks a little bit better and there's no questions really asked. He does the same thing now with Thomas John Wood, because David Stanley had been wounded at Franklin. It's replaced by Wood. So he's visiting with all of these kind of superiors and subordinates alike, kind of getting a feel for the room. Now, I mentioned we would come back to this. There's somebody else that's waiting in Nashville for the 2nd Division's arrival, and it's George Washington Elliott, a brigadier general, and a veteran soldier, a West Pointer, a military man. George Wagner had not really ever been installed as a division commander. That's the problem. It never shows up in a report that says General George Wagner is hereby commanding the 2nd Division, and there's no circular order, there's no special order, there's no field order, nothing. There simply says he will take command of the 2nd Division. Normally, there's a little bit more to that. But Washington Elliott is in Nashville. He's supposed to wait on a division command, and there's one division that needs a new division commander, the 2nd Division of the 4th Corps. So he's installed as the new 2nd Division commander, and Wagner is sort of relegated back to the 2nd Brigade command. Now, some people have implied that this is because of his conduct at Franklin. Well, if that's true, word traveled really fast, because this is already set in motion within days, right? Wagner, for whatever reason, chafes at the thought of losing his division. And so he writes to General George Thomas and visits Thomas at his headquarters, and tells him effectively, I'd like to kind of tender my resignation. And Thomas is also now planning for the Battle of Nashville. There's a lot of pressure on his shoulders. He also needs soldiers who are going to, follow their orders, do what they need to do, and no one should be griping. So Elliott takes command, and Emerson Opdyke, interestingly, writes a letter to Lucy, and he says in the letter that Wagner was deeply cut by this. And Wagner felt as though that there was a sort of a connection that he had with this division that no one else could have. So on December the 9th, Wagner's request to be relieved is approved. And 2 days later, he delivers a farewell address. And that's what I was looking for here. He says, having been relieved from duty with the department at my own request, I find it very hard to part from a command with which I have been so long associated. A command that has made itself notorious for its gallant and meritorious deeds. But wherever I may be, I shall rejoice to hear of your success, as I will, for you can say what few commands can. You never fail. Let us never forget the gallant men who have fallen with us, and if we ever meet any of their families that need our help, divide the last cent with them, hoping to meet you again in times of peace. And it's over. He leaves Nashville, and he goes up to Indianapolis. He's there with his wife by December the 22nd, and there's a newspaper account that says that he's in town, he's looking quite well, and he's greeted really, really quite nicely. In the meantime, he's written letters off to the War Department, and interestingly, he tries to find an assignment in Sherman's command, but Edmund Stanton denies it. And instead of getting a reassignment to active service, Wagner is sent back to Indiana. He gets there, goes into town with his wife, and then just a month or so later, he presides over a military court-martial, and then is sent off to the Department of Missouri. Now, this is the problem. His wife is sick throughout much of this period. Mm-hmm. Francis Day Wagner, had been sick through at least the last 2 or 3 months that he had been in Missouri. April the 3rd, he's back in Indianapolis. Newspaper account there showed that he looked well and hearty, and that all the men of his old corps love him and have always looked with pride upon his indomitable courage and ability. So even after Franklin, he's still got his very strong supporters. April the 8th, he takes command of the Department of Missouri. The very next day, Lee surrenders. And then, if things look up, Lincoln is assassinated April the 14th. And by April the 22nd, Frances Wagner dies. She is very quickly taken to back to Armstrong Chapel and buried. And George Wagner does not get to be with his wife at her death. And I think that has a profound effect on him as well, because when he does finally return home, when everything is over in August of 1865, when his assignments are finally finished and the war is behind him and the military is no longer a piece of his everyday life, he has nothing. His wife is dead. His children are kind of splitting up across the country. So he gets back home to Warren County, Indiana, and by 66 opens up a law office, and it closes within a year. He has really, really bad luck with business. 67, there's this kind of dark period where we just kind of lose him. It sort of disappears. Much of 65 into about 1867. And then it's in that year that as the Republicans are at war with the president, Andrew Johnson, that a front runner for the presidency emerges in Ulysses S. Grant. And Wagner throws every fiber of his being into campaigning for Grant. That Grant wins Indiana in the way that he does is probably no small bit of a contribution on the part of George Wagner. He had gone everywhere. He'd been part of all the veterans, the stump speeches, the poll day parades, everything. And then in February 1869, things really start to look dim. There's a newspaper account, first time we've seen George Wagner in Indianapolis in a long time. And it says Wagner was in town and looking quite more fit than previous, or looking well, as if to imply that he had not been looking well in the kind of dark period where we don't know anything about where he is or what he's doing. The problem, too, for me as a researcher and as somebody who spent a lot of time with George Wagner, frustrates me. He has no personal papers, no diary, no memoir, nothing. It's just gone. February 69 comes along, and he is in shambles. And I think this is the piece of the story that really has always kind of confounded me, but interested me at the same time. he's so representative of a problem that we still face today, right? We have veterans that go off to war, and when they come home, they're shattered. They've been turned into something that's not human, right? They were human beings when they left, but now they've got this new thing unlocked in them, this ability to kill. Or in Wagner's case, not to kill, but to sanction the killing. And now that's gone. And that avenue for kind of unleashing whatever is in the human psyche that can do that is gone. And if he starts to drink, that doesn't make him any different than anyone else. And if he starts to get sick over it, that doesn't make him any different than anyone else. But it's February the 13th, 1869. And we're just a month or so removed from what would be the inauguration of President Grant. And Wagner appears to collapse from a bout of what a doctor would later call nervous suffering. It doesn't really ring a bell to me as to what that is, right? What is nervous suffering? Is it a physical condition? Is he having like an actual painful reaction? Is he, not able to walk? Is he not able to move? Can he not stand up? What's happening? Is it an attack of the nervous system, or is he having a mental breakdown?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've never heard of. I mean,
right? He's just emotionally distraught to the point where it forces him to be physically exhausted. In any case, he visits a doctor, and he goes into this doctor's office, and for 4 or 5 days he'd been sick, and a New Albany newspaper said that he'd been sick for some weeks and had been drinking quite hard. Another instant, that same newspaper said that he had not eaten for days and had subsisted entirely on intoxicating liquors. And then that afternoon, the afternoon of February the 13th, he visited a doctor, and he was prescribed a really, really dangerous mixture of drugs and alcohol. 20 grains of quinine, or quinine sulfate, 1 ounce tincture of yellow jessamine, and a half a pint of brandy. Now, the 3 of them, when mixed together, is incredibly potent and really lethal. So the idea is that you take a portion of it, just a little bit, a small dose. So if you have a little bit of pain, you take a little bit. In Wagner's mind, whatever it was, if it's, this idea of physical pain or mental pain, Wagner gets the prescription and he repairs to his room. He took the entire bottle. He consumed half of the entire dose.
God.
And what's interesting is that the doctor who attended to him in his dying moments was John M. Ewart, or Ewart. I've never actually had to say it out loud. Ewart, who was the surgeon of the 15th Indiana. And he said that Wagner, there's nothing could be done. He was called in at the last hour, but his case was hopeless. So here he is at 40 years old, 5 months, 20 days, dead in the Bates Hotel in downtown Indianapolis. No family really to tend to his funeral. So his burial was quite hastily arranged by the state senate. They arrange a small parade. A guards company, a militia company, is rolled out to escort the casket from the state house to the train, and his body is brought back home to Green Hill or Indian Hill, Indiana. He's buried in Armstrong Chapel Cemetery, not far from his wife and his relatives. And actually got a chance in 2023 to take a little road trip up to the grave, because maybe you guys can relate to this, maybe your listeners can relate to this. We'll never know what these people were like. right? We never have the opportunity to meet them. We don't know what they sounded like, right? We were joking is, what did he sound like, right? How did did he have a really thick Midwestern accent? Was there a little bit of German kind of still tucked in there because his father had only just immigrated, right? What did he sound like? What did he smell like? How did he carry himself? Did he kind of slump his shoulders or did he stand upright? And in our minds, we can imagine all these things. And the closest that we can ever get to meeting them is to go to their gravesite. And if what I felt there, not to get supernatural, right? If what I felt there was any indication of what he was like, no, I'll just describe what the cemetery is. It's very plain. It's very unimpressive. And I mean no offense to the congregation of the Armstrong Chapel Methodist Church that meets there. But it's very plain. It's very unassuming. And that fits, right? The headstone, his monument above his grave is actually really nicely done. It's very ornate. I think it was paid for by his brothers. But it has a Masonic emblem. And then right below that, there's an eagle that's clutching a shield with 2 crossed swords and banners draped beneath its wings. And the epitaph simply says, General George Wagner died February 13th, 1869, aged 40 years, 5 months, 20 days. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
He's got a GAR marker in front of it. Occasionally there's a flag put out. I know we brought a flag and put it out, but it's about what you would expect. But the gravesite gives you the idea that the dead sleep in peace, and the dead do not sleep in peace, especially in George Wagner's case, because it's 20 years after he's dead, and all of a sudden, great argument breaks out. Who saved the day at the Battle of Franklin?
Uh-huh.
What's that scoundrel George Wagner doing by sacrificing the advance line? And all of a sudden, you fast forward to, gosh, when was my first trip? 2012, 2013 up to Franklin. And the story I heard was John Bell Hood was laced out on laudanum, passed out super high, and was given commands that no one could understand. He was sacrificing his army, and the Confederate Army of Tennessee was suicidal and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And what was really odd was that their adversary was this guy who was just absolutely plastered and drunk and screaming and shouting at everybody and picking fights with all of his subordinates. So when you left Franklin, you might have thought that it was a drug addict fighting a drunk. And that was it. And that's why it was so bloody, and that's why it was so terrible. And maybe that's why nobody wanted to remember it. So they just built all over it. Now, who cares? Mm-hmm. So that didn't sit well, right? And then, but when you start to piece it together, you can really see how Hood becomes a villain, and at the same time that Hood becomes a villain, George Wagner's becoming a villain, because both sides, right? You've got to find a way to blame the Confederate defeat on someone, so Hood. Mm-hmm. You also have to find someone to blame the big, massive mistake of the advance line being crushed, and all those casualties, and all the killed, and all the wounded, and all the missing, and all the great controversy that comes out. You got to find somebody to blame that on. But you also need to find someone who saved the day. And if you had to save the day, that means that something went wrong, and it had to be saved. So then all of a sudden, we start to piece this thing together. 1880 or 81, Jacob Cox's book on the Atlanta campaign comes out, March to the Sea and the Battles of Franklin and Nashville. And in there, he basically says what he'd been saying since 1864, which is that, the fight was desperate, it was awful, it was terrible, it was brutal, all these things. And Opdyke's brigade came forward and really played an important part in helping to stem the Confederate attack. Well, in 1881, when it's published, Emerson Opdyke reads it and goes, well, that's not good enough. You told me that I was the hero of battle, and why aren't you saying that now? And when you read their exchange, and you can actually see Cox's papers at Oberlin College, Cox's answer to Opdyke, you can almost smell the frustration. because he says, my dear Emerson, it seems as though time and distance have caused you disillusion. To correct you on the really fine service that you did, it seems as if we're denying you the glorious service that you did. In fact, all that Cox is telling him effectively is, there were a lot of guys who were fighting, and it was more than just you. There's a lot of other really important things happening, and you were really important, but so was 44th Missouri, so was all the men under your command, so were the guns of the 20th Ohio, so was Riley's brigade. And their communication stops in, I think, September of 1882. Just simply cuts them off. It seems mutual. It seems like Opdyke is tired of hearing from Wagner or from Cox, and Cox is clearly very tired of hearing from Opdyke. And then, same time frame, Opdyke writes a story about the Battle of Franklin in a New York newspaper. Because he's become this kind of businessman, sort of tycoon in New York. And he publishes this newspaper accounting of the battle where he says effectively he was only in position at Franklin to do what he did because he was insubordinate to Wagner earlier in the day, even though there's not really any clear evidence of insubordination on Opdyke's part or Wagner's part. But then throws out the hero of Franklin line again. And it really starts to cement itself because Opdyke has quite the following. He's an old Army of the Cumberland officer.
Mm-hmm.
And the Army of the Cumberland, if we know anything, us guys who study the Western Theater, the Army of the Cumberland sticks together.
A tight group.
That's why there's still guys that get together with pitchforks and say bad things about you if you say something even remotely not glowingly positive about George Thomas.
Wait. George Thomas, who lost the Battle of Chickamauga. Let's make sure we have that straight. I want to get that out there right now, right?
I hear that.
Someone's knocking at the door here.
Yeah.
They're not knocking. They're kicking down the door. But that's the level of loyalty that they have to their officers. And so when Opdyke says, I was the hero of the battle, then everybody says, Opdyke was the hero of the battle. Don't you know that? What's interesting is that some of his fellow officers are highly critical. It's not just Jacob Cox, even David Stanley, who by this point in his life has kind of gone off the deep end. But admittedly, he's had a lot of issues. I mean, you think about what he was doing in the 1870s. He was the commanding officer over Custer's movements out west. And so he's not had a great kind of time. But when he goes out west, he seems to just kind of lose it by the 1880s, 1890s. And he goes on a tirade in his memoir about everyone that he dealt with in the Tennessee campaign. Says, John Schofield isn't fit to carry water on both shoulders. Says that Opdyke proved an ingrate. He said, I did all these things for him and all he'd ever do is complain about me. And it gets kind of bloody there, that second round. But then everything kind of quiets down. 1897 or 1884, Opdyke is dead. He has an accidental discharge of a firearm while he's cleaning it, which is worth looking into. Probably way too much for this episode. It could be its own, but how does a guy who fought for 3.5 years in the American Civil War just decide to shoot himself in the gut with a loaded revolver while he's cleaning it, and there's never any real investigation into it, and his son says, oh yeah, he was cleaning it. Don't worry about it. Just fishy, something smells. But by 1897, Cox's book, The Monograph on the Battle of Franklin, is out, and then it gets really quiet until 1927. Thomas Hay writes his book, Hood's Tennessee Campaign, kind of mentions in there basically what we've said, is there's a lot more to what happened at the advance line, and they just get overrun. But he doesn't put that in the text. Instead, it's in the endnotes. So unless you're going to read the endnotes, you'll never know that there was some nuance to what happened out there. But he said, he couldn't quite figure out what it was. There's clearly more information out there, but in an era without access to widespread archives and everything, Hay just had to kind of make the best guess, which is that it probably isn't right, but we'll see. The problem is that from 1927 really until the 1980s, there's nothing written about Franklin. The exception being a Tennessee Historical Quarterly article written in the 1950s by Sims Crownover. Really, it's not until 5 Tragic Hours is published by James Lee McDonough and Tom Conley that anyone writes about Franklin. Anybody even bothers to look at it. And that makes Wagner out to be a total drunk, because now a big myth has been created, and it goes all the way back to 1883. A letter from David Stanley to Marshall Thatcher, who's writing the history of the 23rd Michigan Cavalry Regiment in the American Civil War. It's got a much longer title than that, but Stanley says to Thatcher that Wagner was drunk, or was in vainglorious condition, if not drunk, full of whiskey. The issue is that David Stanley wasn't there. He didn't see Wagner all day long. The only interactions that they had were through staff officers. And by the time that Wagner would have seen Stanley, Stanley had been wounded and Wagner was at the river. So the two couldn't have really crossed all that effectively. The other problem is that when you look at all of the other soldiers and all of the other men who wrote histories of the battle, who wrote memoirs, who wrote reports, who knew that there was a controversy, and I guess the trump card here is Emerson Opdyke. If no one else said that Wagner was drinking or drunk that day, it automatically makes me suspicious of Stanley's claim. Because if you wanted to really prove that you were in the right with not going in the advanced line and you really are the hero, why would you not say my division commander was drunk?
Yeah.
But he doesn't. He never says that. Okay, all right, that's probably not convincing, but I did find another piece of evidence as R.N. Brown. He writes a account in the National Tribune. And he basically says, yeah, I have a really good friend who's the postmaster in Rock City, Iowa, and he was at the Battle of Franklin, and I trust him, and you should trust him because I trust him. And he said that he thought Wagner was drinking at the Battle of Franklin. So then, sicko that I am, went and looked up who was the postmaster of Rock City, Iowa. I think it was like 1885 when he wrote this. And I found out that it was T.C. Gregg, Thomas Gregg, who was a courier for Joseph Conrad. Now I'm thinking, damn, well, maybe he was drinking because Gregg would have seen him. Except when you look up anything about Thomas Gregg, he never wrote about it. Never even mentions. Nothing published that I could find in detail. Nothing. So what's the coincidence is that it comes out a year after Stanley had already written the letter to Thatcher. So maybe it's just somebody doubling down on what he had heard or thought. Anyhow, whatever the case, that sits dormant until the 1980s. And then all of a sudden, Conley and McDonough get their hands on it. And Wagner's not just drunk, he's the drunkest he's ever been. And he's the drunkest man alive at that moment. And then just a couple years later, Lively Sword writes his book. Then Wagner being relieved when he gets to Nashville isn't about the fact that he had never actually been in command of the 2nd Division in the first place. He's just kind of a placeholder. It has nothing to do with George Washington Eliot. It has to do with the fact that reports of his drinking had already made its way back to Thomas's headquarters, and Thomas was going to discipline him, except nothing is written about that.
Yeah.
So then it just becomes this kind of conjecture, and really there's one place that you can trace all this back to. 1990s at the Carter House. The place was a haven for myth making. It was a factory of a memory factory, if you would allow me to use that kind of heady term. It's where we were manufacturing ideas about history, fantasies about history. And it got kind of entwined and ingrained into the memory of the Battle of Franklin that Hood was on laudanum and stupid and incompetent. Forrest is a god. Claiborne is a patron saint of all Irish Confederate immigrants. And George Wagner is a drunk. Emerson Opdyke is a hero. Jacob Cox, who is that guy? I've never even heard of him. John Schofield, loser, nerd, big math geek. That's all he ever was. And the earthworks were 17 feet high. And Todd Carter is the mowed down son who is a hero in his own right. All these things, all the fluffy kind of romantic stories that come out of it. There's also a lot of scapegoating that's done. And a lot of that can be seen early on in the kind of post-war memoirs that are written. There's a lot of CYA, if you catch my drift.
Oh, yeah.
And that breeds into later myth making because you have a little shred of evidence, so why not run with it? And so it really is all that eventually tarnishes the reputation of, I think, a very capable and a very respectable soldier, a good soldier, and a man who, like I said in the very beginning, if you're still with us after now what seems like eternity, a man who saw what was happening in 1861 as a wrong. He saw secession as an armed rebellion against the United States. A man that loved his country so much that he would volunteer to go off and fight to defend it and fight to save it, to save the American Republic, to serve his country. He deserves to be remembered. His story deserves to be told. And at the same time, too, he's the embodiment of so many other men who don't get the flair, who don't get the attention, who don't get the book written about them, who don't get a podcast recorded about them. But he is a physical representative of those soldiers. His story is representative of the volunteers that went off to fight and serve their country. And I think, too, his demise is maybe a lesson for all of us to care for the veterans, care for the men and women that go off and fight to defend us and defend our freedoms and defend our liberties and come home and live shattered lives.
Yeah.
That's the case for him. And I think that's ultimately what will always draw me back to George Wagner, is that he's relatable and his story is not really ever dead.
Mm-hmm.
It's as alive today as he was.
Yeah.
There, now trying in the show.
Well, that's it.
That's where they cue the Monty Python music, right? Right. So wrong. I know that was wrong. Well, is there a chance? I mean, just as speculative, and I don't like speculative, and most of us don't. We try to solve things from a historical point of view with facts, right, and corroboration. Is there a chance, because he was suffering from nervous suffering, that maybe he took that concoction? Just, I'm done.
So there was a report in the New Albany newspaper that said that they thought it was a suicide, but it was very quickly ruled out. I'll tell you the way that I think it happened, right? Because this is my speculation to answer your speculation. I think he thought that if a little dose helps a little, a larger dose helps a lot. And if he was in pain, he wanted to relieve the pain. And if he was fighting some kind of demon, right, to use that expression, a larger dose would make it go away faster and he can get back to peace. And I really do think it got to this point of desperation. Like he just had to end whatever was plaguing him. And so if it was a larger dose that he was prescribed, well, maybe it would work faster. Not realizing that it would put all of his organs into an immediate shutdown mode, and he'd spend the last few moments of his life unable to do anything, speak, breathe. He would slowly suffocate and die. And I think his last moments were truly horrifying. But I don't think he would have known it. I don't think he would have done that. Yeah, no. Again, speculation, but
sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So when's the book coming out?
Well, we'll see. I'm rewriting it right now. Because basically it's my master's thesis with some things I've added here and there and bits and pieces of stuff I've come across in the last 4 and 5 years being in Franklin. And I think being there every day, 365, 24/7 was like, I can't think about this when I'm not at work. So I had to put distance between Franklin, George Wagner, and myself.
Yeah.
And I put distances about 580 miles. So maybe now I'll get to actually sit down and really get it finished. Because like I said, I want to tell his story and it deserves to be told. And he's an an incredible subject, I think, for study, just not only for his war record, but then what he represents, right? Who he represents.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
There was one thing I was thinking about whenever you were talking about the order, that it wasn't put in any record. It was an oral kind of order, and it really reminded me of Lew Wallace at Shiloh in a way, like that that order that somehow went missing, and then after that, his reputation is hit pretty hard.
Yeah,
and that's a different story for another day, obviously. But it just, whenever you were talking about that, I was like, that sounds awfully
and how many
familiar.
times the situations like come up in Wagner's life or any of these guys? How many times does it plague somebody else too?
Yeah.
Right?
And then you get a bunch of people together that are like, okay, let's get our story.
Yep.
And we're all going to go after this one person.
Yeah.
Yep.
A year later, that's, they corroborate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, guys, it's been a blast. It's always fun to get to talk about Franklin and,
maybe we'll talk about old Francis Cockrell at Franklin here soon. That would,
Yeah,
I'd really like to hear about them.
We got to do the whole brigade though, because they're just, it's just, like I said, they're just badasses. They're so cool.
What they do at Champion Hill, I think, is just
their wartime, just beginning to end, is so fascinating because they're everywhere and they do everything.
Mm-hmm.
Now we could start right now, but I'd need to. Got a whole day of saying, "Yeah, dada." So I'm done. It's fine. I gave you the last living brain cell. Sorry.
All right. Well, we really appreciate you being on here and
absolutely
talking with us about this. That was a fascinating discussion there. Just listening to that, and because Wagner is somebody that when I was in high school, because I've got it right here, and the two books I had on Franklin when I was in high school, early 2000s. These are right here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
and
story.
Yeah, and that DVD that came out after the 2004 reenactment, the Wide Awake Films one, and I watched that all the time, mostly because I was always trying to find myself in it. But I remember distinctly the claim that Wagner was drunk, and his men was left out there to their own, and for years I thought, Wagner, man, what
an idiot.
Yeah, exactly. And then whenever you started coming out with your thesis, and I remember you mentioning a little bit about it, and I was like, now that is going to be, that's a cool story, to see what actually happened with that guy, and now you got it out. So it's for us to hear. And
well, I think it goes a long way for those of us with open minds.
Yeah.
Sam Hood, disproving the laudanum charges, and having those open minds, because I will still see people who will make those posts that Wiley Sword's book is the best on Franklin. It might be an extremely well written book.
It's a beautiful book.
Beautiful, wonderful writer. By the way, it should be Embrace an Angry Wind, that whole Confederates Last Hurrah crap, whatever. Right. But it goes such a long way because he is such a known writer. It goes such a long way in just perpetrating these myths that continue to, that certain elements continue to gravitate to and will never go away from, no matter what. But it is always refreshing to hear the correct perspectives, or at least new interpretations on perspectives.
And I'm not saying I'm right about everything. It's, it's for the listener and for the reader to decide.
That's right.
But that's
what you can do as a historian. Yeah. You've got the evidence that you're able to find and that you're given, and you got to make your conclusion from that. And not everybody's going to agree. And that's just how it is.
It's all right. My house is used to people gathering with pitchforks.
Well, see, I'm lucky. I live on the 5th floor of a condo, and we actually have a doorman. So,
can't all be you, Daryl. Some of us live with our in-laws.
Not that doorman's going to stop a whole lot of people, but at the same point, it's like, at least there's a little bit of a warning there, right? Like a tripwire, right? Give me a chance to go load the dispenser carbine or something, right? So
that's one way to do it right there.